Singapore's politicians have been hogging the spotlight recently, but for all the wrong reasons. JP Ong is here to tell us more. Good morning.
Good morning, Sri. What defines a controversy depends on the country and the culture, how high a standard they hold themselves to, and how frequently used they are to these scandals and controversies. And in the case of Singapore, the last couple of months, maybe just a little bit more than usual, actually. You'll have to go back to May, actually, when the first two senior ministers were actually subject to an investigation for possible wrongdoing because of the rent of high-end, high-class bungalows in parts of Singapore. Now, the Corruption Practices Board did find them not guilty or find no evidence of corruption or wrongdoing, but it did reveal that these high-end class bungalows were being rented by these senior officials between 19,000 to 26,500 Singapore dollars a month. And in a time when we're seeing a lot of Singaporeans facing higher costs of living and growing or shrinking spending power, it did raise a few emotions out in Singapore. Now, over the last week, we've also seen this also escalate. We did hear that the Transport Minister, Mr. Eswatson, and also the Managing Director of Hotel Properties were actually arrested as part of a corruption probe. Both of them are now being questioned or now cooperating, it seems, with authorities. But although both have not been directly charged, it seems the Transport Minister was also questioned by the CPIB for 10 hours the other day, according to various reports here in Singapore. And just earlier this week, we also heard of the Speaker of Parliament and a Member of Parliament also resigning on Monday because of a discovered inappropriate relationship between both of them. So you're seeing that the three controversies, I'll call them controversies for the time being, are different in nature, and also varying in perhaps degree of gravity also, but does also mean it was a heavy last couple of weeks for Singapore.
JP, let's get into this with Eugene Tan, who is Associate Professor of Law at Singapore Management University. He's also a former nominated Member of Parliament here in Singapore. Eugene, good morning.
Thank you.
Do these controversies tarnish Singapore's reputation for good governance?
Well, I think JP gave a very good roundup. I think they do. They do simply because the ruling party has set itself to very high standards of honesty, integrity, and probity. And I think the perception is that, the party has fallen short. And if you hold yourself to such high standards, then I think there is the expectation, or in fact the demand, because here we are looking at a party that's governed Singapore since 1959, that people have come to expect or even demand such high standards. So I would say that it has been a very severe period in terms of the reputational damage. But I think what is more significant is the sort of question it raises about whether the ruling party has fallen short of its own high standards.
When you look at the gravity, though, and if you have spent a lot of time looking at Southeast Asian politics, some might actually say that the totem pole of what you call a scandal, you might say this is middle at best. You're talking about inappropriate relationships or affairs in one case, and another one, really the rent of high-class bungalows, which they say were still within the means of the salaries of these ministers. But why do you think, Professor, it's been so emotionally charged or emotionally stirring, for lack of a better term, for many Singaporeans? Why do these things seem like such a big deal, whereas perhaps in the rest of the region, maybe people wouldn't bat that much of an eyelash?
No, you're absolutely right. I think, in many ways, what you've described, would be in a way par for the course, let's say for other countries. But I would say that in Singapore, politicians are held to a much higher standard. And of course, the PAP has whole basis of its political legitimacy has been on clean and incorrupt governance, right? So the local phrase is that you have to be whiter than white. I mean, white being the ruling party's uniform. So you have this situation in which the perception is whether the ruling party is increasingly out of touch with the ordinary Singaporeans who are going through what is seen as a fairly difficult period. While things are still generally going well, I think the perception of social inequity, the social inequalities, I think this tend to rankle Singaporeans a bit more. I would say that maybe it's something to do with the pandemic, where the disparities within Singapore society came to the fore. And I think this is just in many ways a follow-up. And of course, it doesn't help that you have a spate of incidents that I think have conspired together or come together, to make people wonder, right, whether the ruling party, has fallen, from the high perch that it had put itself on.
Eugene, you make the point that the PAP, the ruling party here, will probably need to pay a political price. What do you mean by that? And are there implications for the 4G leadership succession? And is all of this going to be ancient history and blow over by the time of the next election in 2025?
Well, I think the next election will have to be held, in slightly more than under about 2 years' time, right? So time is of the essence. And by political price, I mean, given the sort of backlash, or at least the perception, right? I think, whether the PAP could have done better. I would say that, at the very minimal, it has cast the element of doubt. And so voters would be more prepared to look at what other parties have to offer. And I think it raises question about whether, there could be more opposition members of parliament, in the legislature, to ensure that the party is better scrutinized. And we're looking at a pivotal election, right? Because the next general election would be the election where, the next generation of leaders, right? In Singapore, we call them the 4G leaders, will take over from the team, or rather, Prime Minister Lee Hsien Loong. And so if you have a situation where, core members of the fourth generation leadership somehow do not get elected, because of a subpar or underwhelming performance, then that's going to affect, that leadership succession, right? Because core members will not get elected. And so the question is whether, the ruling party has sufficient depth in terms of its quality, right, to be able to have other MPs step forward. Because, Singapore is dependent,
yes,
right, on quality leadership.
And so, looking at this right now, I mean, is an expedited handover, perhaps a holding of the elections earlier than scheduled, would that actually suit Singapore so they can make a decision on things?
Well, JP, I think the imperative now for the ruling party is to heal the ground, if I can put it that way. To undo the damage, to regain whatever loss of trust and confidence. But I think we should not overstate the backlash. I think there are concerns raised, but I still think that the PAP support, still rests on a fairly big reservoir of goodwill, trust, and confidence. But I would say that, it raises question about, whether the timeline should be re-looked at. I don't think the answer would be a further delay. We are looking at the fourth generation leaders that, most of them have been put in place since 2011. And Prime Minister Lee, had indicated that, he would have liked to step down, when he turned 70, and he's now over 70.
Yes.
So I think that the longer the delay, right, I think it will raise a lot of concerns about whether the next generation of leaders are ready, to take over.